Hello, Grayson Room students. Welcome back, and thank you guys for keeping up and following along with me. Today, we're actually going to finish up Chapter 8, and I mentioned that our test on Friday will be on Chapter 8, so we'll be getting ready for that. When we finished yesterday, we were talking about the army and changes to the army, so today we're just going to wrap up the last little bits of Chapter 8 and learn about the end of Augustus's reign. Now, kind of an extension of the military was how the empire expanded during Augustus's reign. It did grow quite a bit. We mentioned yesterday how top military officers were appointed by Augustus because he wanted direct control over the military. He also raised their pay during their reign, during their time in office. This became a popular tool by later emperors to get the loyalty of men whenever they took over or something. They would give them a nice pay bump, and that way the men are loyal to them. So it's a good thing at first glance, but it kind of eventually got out of control. It's where the pay was getting so high that it was hard to sustain. So we'll talk more about that later. Augustus was skeptical of aristocrats commanding his legions. So we mentioned that the most important ones he would leave to family members, to if he had a stepson or a grandson or whoever he had to do that, or maybe novi homines, who we know are new men who are not from an aristocratic noble background, but they're the first person in their family to kind of rise to new heights. So he didn't want to give those prime positions to someone who was kind of hungry for power and might pose some sort of threat to him. Anytime you're controlling a military this big and powerful, things can happen. So mutinies were always a concern in the ancient world. We've seen even the best commanders, mutinies happen. We saw that happen to Alexander the Great and some others, but the army remained remarkably loyal to Augustus during his reign, which we mentioned yesterday was a long reign of 40 years. He seemed to treat them right. He wasn't crazy. His rules and his reign made sense. And like I said, he did give them a good bump in pay and a better retirement system that we discussed yesterday. So that probably led to a lot of the loyalty. Within Rome itself and within the empire, things were pretty stable and peaceful during his reign. That's one of the things that made him popular. But of course, there was expansion happening on the periphery. So there was fighting during Augustus's reign. It wasn't just completely peaceful, but mostly it was happening on the outskirts of the empire to expand Roman territory in certain places. But if you lived in some place that was already kind of peacefully part of the Roman Empire, it was a fairly peaceful time for you, Augustus's reign. We will talk about some areas that were not completely under control during Augustus' reign. Everything didn't go perfectly, so not all parts of the empire were under control. That comes up in the next slide. Some examples of places that came under the emperor's control, under the Roman Empire, would be the Iberian Peninsula. That's like Spain and Portugal. Happened in the 20s BC. We talked before in a previous chapter about those tribes on the Iberian Peninsula, just very, very fiercely independent, and they had never quite been subdued until Augustus did that here, at least fully. He also sent commanders to extend his empire to the north and to the east, and that would be kind of pushing up into Germany and even areas up there kind of approaching Romania and areas like that. And they pushed as far as the Danube River, which became, during Augustus' reign, the Danube River became one of the boundary lines of the northeastern section of the empire. Augustus really preferred having geographical boundaries to the empire. It made it much more easy to patrol and to protect than just having a line in the sand or something. He loved it to be a river or a mountain range or something that could be more easily protected. During this conquest of the northeastern part of Europe, 5 new provinces were added from that conflict alone. Also, the province of Judea was added to the empire in AD 6. So that would be, we know that Jerusalem had already been previously taken, but now we have an entire province around that area taken. Everything did not go perfectly along the way. There were some setbacks, of course, because Augustus reigned for 40 years. It wouldn't be reasonable for everything to go swimmingly. So in AD 6, there was a big rebellion in the provinces of Dalmatia and Pannonia. This was a big deal. Augustus, by that time, was too old to fight himself and a little bit past that. So he did send Tiberius, of course, his stepson and adopted son, to put that down. Tiberius was a good commander. He was supposedly pretty smart with the strategy, but it took 3 years to put down. So it shows you how fierce of a fight that must have been. Now, one of the biggest setbacks during Augustus's reign, and this is one you should definitely pay attention to, was a major battle in AD 9. This is where three Roman legions, contended by Varus, Publius Quintilius Varus, they were ambushed by a set of by German troops, and basically these three legions were destroyed and wiped out. And this is known as the Battle of the Teutoburg Forest. Basically, the Romans were just not smart; they were caught unaware, and they were just completely wiped out. Um, During this battle, the Germans were led by Arminius. Sometimes, if you read a more modern history book, they call him Herman, but Arminius was his name back then, and he was actually a German, but he had actually kind of joined the Roman army. Right? They would take new people in, basically from their new provinces. They wanted new people to join and kind of become more Roman. So Arminius had actually joined the Roman army. He had moved up the ranks a little bit. He had become a Roman citizen. But then when push came to shove, he returned back to his German tribes and he led the revolt against the Romans. And this is notable because it meant that he understood things about the Roman military that other people wouldn't, their tactics and their training, and he probably used that against them in this battle. So if you're a Roman, the mention of this battle would be kind of just a negative idea completely. This would, if you remember back to the Battle of Cannae in the Second Punic War, this one ranks up there, probably top three, with the Battle of Cannae is just the biggest disasters in Roman history. And the soldiers who died here, apparently some of them were taken prisoner and killed in very horrific ways, like burned alive and stuff. So this was considered very, very bad, the Battle of the Teutoburg Forest. Apparently, when Augustus heard the news, of course, he was not there. He was furious, and he went into kind of a reports say that he went into like kind of a furious rage that this has happened, and said that he had to get payback and to get their eagles back. The eagle meant each legion had an eagle that was kind of its standard that it had to protect and maintain, and he wanted his eagles back from the Germans who had stolen it. So of course, this didn't make the empire crumble, but it was a major, major blow, major setback in Germany. So overall, with the good things and bad things about expansion, he took pride in about doubling the size of the empire during his reign. So that shows you how massive of this was. But he thought, kind of towards the end of his life, that Rome was kind of reaching the size that was manageable um, to govern. And he actually warned Tiberius when it looked like Tiberius would be a successor. Don't keep just blindly expanding, expanding, expanding. We had this idea in the modern day that Rome just kind of, certainly their goal must have been to take over the entire world, right? Of course they wanted that, but that doesn't seem to be their goal most of the time. Augustus warned that we're at kind of a good place right now where we have natural borders and things like that, and we don't just need to keep going, or it's going to be too hard to manage much of a bigger empire. So we'll see what later emperors do with that, but that was Augustus's recommendations. At least don't just keep expanding, expanding, expanding. Think about holding what you have. Now, some things Augustus worked on within the city of Rome itself during his reign. We talked about how Rome had been in war for many decades before his reign. So the city was in some ways falling apart at certain places. It had not been, no one's thinking about repairing roads and repairing temples and stuff whenever there's a big civil war on. So when Augustus finally kind of got to take a breath and the civil war was over, he looked around and said, I've got to kind of improve this city and make it worthy of a capital of this major empire. So that was one of his big things. And there was a famous quote of Augustus where he said, near the end of his life, he said, I found Rome a city of brick and left it a city of marble, meaning he kind of beautified it, changed everything, made everything so that it was much more splendid and prominent than it had been before. So he focused on improving cities' amenities and restoring temples, streets, public buildings, and even building new ones. He knew that this was one of the ways to make people appreciative and to love him was to, hey, give them things they're actually going to use, right? If you're doing things that no one notices, that's not going to get you support. But if you're making this beautiful new temple, this new building that everyone can enjoy, a park or something, that's going to make people appreciative and actually see what you're doing. So some examples of new things he built all around the city of Rome during his 40-year reign: a new basilica, which is a law court that was needed at the time, a new Senate house. Remember, they had never quite rebuilt the Senate when it was burnt down. Remember how that was decades ago when it burnt down, and it's just there had been so many wars and stuff, they couldn't focus on that. So a new Senate house was built for the senators. A new forum called the Forum Augustum. The original forum was getting kind of small and tight for the city. He built the temple of Mars Ultor, or Mars the Avenger. That was a major temple that the legend says that he had vowed to build this temple he won the war against Antony and the assassins before that. So when he won these wars, he built this temple to Mars Ultor, Mars the Avenger. He built a big mausoleum, which was for the remains of him and his family and his close family, and also a big one, the Ara Pacis, which is the altar of peace that was supposed to kind of represent the peace he had brought to the Roman Empire during his reign. We talked about there was fighting in certain places, but largely most citizens would feel like this is a very peaceful place. You can see in the picture here on this page of a group of students. I take students from Rome every few years. We're going next year as well in 2021. This is us kind of out by one of the Roman aqueducts bringing water into the city. And on my last trip, we also went to the Ara Pacis, the altar of peace. They've actually cleaned it and beautified it, and they put a kind of a big building around it. So it's a really great place to go look at now, the altar of peace. It's still mostly there, mostly intact. Now, all these building projects, they were meant to raise his prestige, but also there's a practical effect to it that it made more construction jobs. So it's going to help unemployment. People are going to feel like, hey, there's places to work around the city if I move to Rome, and people are going to move to Rome specifically because the jobs are there. So during Augustus's reign, we think that Rome got up to 1 million inhabitants, which for nowadays isn't that big of a city. It's a big city, but not a huge city like New York or London or something. But for the ancient world, that was a massive city, and it was like nothing no one had ever seen before. And so it needed all sorts of services and water and food and all sorts of things like that. To deliver the water, we had 3 new aqueducts built, and some of these were built by Agrippa, who was, Augustus' right-hand man we talked about before. He instituted the building of some of these. You can see one of these aqueducts on the picture there I mentioned a minute ago. He also established 3 urban cohorts, which were meant to keep law and order. In other words, kind of patrols. We don't necessarily call them police per se, but kind of like that, where they're patrols meant to keep law and order, meant to keep, violent crime and thing away. The Praetorian Guard, who was Augustus's guard, they were patrolling the city also, but sometimes they just didn't have enough presence to be everywhere. So he doubled that with urban cohorts. Other things that people enjoyed for Augustus was new forms of entertainment or new avenues for entertainment, perhaps. So during his reign, we have records of putting on 8 gladiatorial games, 3 athletic games, which would be like races and sporting events, 26 public hunts, and even 1 Naumachia. Naumachia was a pretty cool event where they would go to a body of water, a lake, or sometimes it could even be artificially made. The Colosseum didn't exist at this time, so some of you probably are thinking that this would go on the Colosseum. Maybe it did later, but the Colosseum has not been built yet. So, but basically, wherever they held this, some big body of water, they would be kind of a naval battle where you would see people fighting on ships, and it could be kind of a real back and forth. It could be like a staging of a battle, like a recreation of a battle, like the Battle of Actium. Let's kind of recreate that. So that's what Naumachia was. The reason only one of those is they're supposed to be massive undertakings because ships have to be built, men have to be trained, we have to find a location and build seating. So that was supposedly a very major undertaking. So people love these entertainments. They love being able to look forward to these things, and they would have, given Augustus some credit for all of these entertainments over his reign. Now, what about outside the city of Rome? He was pretty popular within the city of Rome. Also, the rest of Italy outside of Rome and also the provinces, it seemed like most people liked the reign of Augustus, at least from what we could tell. Obviously, sometimes it's hard to tell the common people's views because, you have books written by prominent senators and authors and kind of famous people, quote unquote. But it seems like most people would have liked this time because, again, it was pretty peaceful in most parts of the empire, and people were seemingly just sick of the wars that have been going on for the last several decades. So they gave Augustus credit for that. Augustus also started a census of every region of the empire, basically to get an idea of how many people actually live in our areas, how many people live here, and also for tax purposes, which is a really big deal. And in fact, the famous census from the Bible where Mary and Joseph were taking the baby Jesus back to their hometown to be counted in the census. This was during the reign of Augustus. So Augustus is actually mentioned in that part of the Bible. I think they call him Caesar, but it's clear that means Caesar Augustus. If you were a new area of the empire, you could count on there being better roads eventually connecting your province to Italy and to other places. And that was a big benefit of being part of the empire. And new colonies were founded also around the empire. And one last piece here about attitudes outside of Rome. Within Rome, we know that Julius Caesar was deified, but it had not yet become common to think of an emperor being divine during their life. Maybe after their life, they became a god. That goes all the way back even to Romulus, the first king. But in other areas, we know, especially more eastern areas, they were more comfortable with thinking of someone as a god. We know that the Persians kind of thought that with their kings at certain times, and the Egyptians and others. So in certain areas, there sprang up these cults who kind of thought of the emperor as maybe a divinity or quasi divinity, and that became kind of popular in certain areas. And eventually, it turns into what we call the imperial cult, and other emperors will follow in the same footsteps. Never became super strong within Rome itself, but again, in some areas of the empire, that was a popular thing. And here on the left, we actually have what's supposed to be a statue of Augustus's Genius, which is like his spirit. And again, this is a statue they would have used to kind of worship his spirit, his aura. Augustales were freedmen in some of these towns who were almost priests in charge of these cults dedicated to Augustus, the final emperor. So, at the end of this chapter, you should have already read this, but the book kind of gives a little final assessment of Augustus. It's hard to exaggerate just his importance to the city of Rome itself. He, like I said, ruled for 40 years. Probably no other single emperor has as much effect on the city and the empires themselves. There's certainly some other big ones we'll talk about, some major ones, but Augustus is definitely near the very top of those. So he was ruling for long enough to transform every area of Roman society into his own image. And that's kind of a big deal. You can imagine if a president nowadays ruled for 40 years, how big of an effect they have on America, because the longest we ever get is 8 years, right? And also, even though he was very, very capable and very charismatic, and he did a lot of good, partially he must credit circumstances with part of his success, because he was very good at what he did, but also the circumstances of taking power at a time when people were sick of civil war and people were kind of ready for someone to just take control and calm things down. That probably helped him rule so successfully for 40 years. When he died, he was very popular due to how Rome had grown. The Romans loved that, and the relative peace within the empire, right? Yeah, we hear about there's wars in this faraway province or something, but within Rome itself and within the empire, it's mostly peaceful. There'd also been an all-volunteer army, and people were not being drafted or forced to participate, and that was popular as well. Just at a personal level, he seemed concerned for his citizens as far as they could tell. His policies and laws and stuff seemed to show genuine concern, and he didn't flaunt his authority. He didn't try to show people how much he could show off his power and show as the king. He tried to, his power is going to be behind the scenes. He's going to exert it, but he didn't flaunt it. He didn't try to rub it in people's face, especially the senators and stuff. So looking back on him, it seems like he kind of combined different good parts about previous leaders and brought them into a position that worked better, right? Because we know Julius Caesar was very, very talented, but maybe some of the things he did led to his assassination. So he saw that Sulla made certain mistakes, Pompey made mistakes, certainly Caesar made mistakes, Antony made mistakes by, going to Eastern and having Cleopatra and everything. So he tried to learn from all these prominent men and put his own stamp on Rome. And at the bottom here, you can see a picture of the walls. This is a room in Augustus's imperial palace that they've actually uncovered on the Palatine Hill not too long ago. So pretty cool thing there, right near the Roman Forum. So we will end there with the death of Augustus in AD 14, and that will end chapter 8. I've enjoyed going over it with you guys. There's a lot more emperors to come. Don't worry, Augustus is just one of many. They will not all have a chapter. In fact, most of them will not, because there's just no way to do that. But Augustus was just so big that he gets his own chapter. And we'll get into the rest of the Julio-Claudian emperors in the next chapter. Okay, so thank you guys for following along. Hopefully these kind of chats are helping you guys understand everything as you read along in the book. And we're going to do our test online on chapter 8 on Friday, and so tomorrow I will post kind of a practice or some kind of activity for you guys to study. But you can go ahead and be studying your notes to prepare for that to that test. Okay, remember to pop in my office hours if you want to talk about chapter 8 or if something here just doesn't make perfect sense, and make sure to check your on-campus page every day for the next assignment. Okay, hope you guys are having a great day, great time at home with your family. Hope everyone's doing well. I'll see you tomorrow.